Okay, this is part 41 of Nos4a2. Bradenburg, Kentucky. He saved the hardest part for last. In May 2012, Nathan Demeter hauled the engine out of the Wraith with a chain fault and spent 2 days rebuilding it, cleaning push rods and replacing the head bolts with parts ordered from a specialty shop in England. The engine was a big 4,257cc straight six, and sitting on his work table, it looked like some vast mechanical heart, which was what it was, he supposed. So many a man's inventions, the syringe, the sword, the pen, the gun, were metaphorical cocks. But the internal combustion engine had to have been dreamt up by a man who had looked upon the human heart. Be cheaper to rent a limo, Michelle said. You wouldn't get your hands dirty. If you think I've got a problem with getting my hands dirty, he said, then you weren't paying much attention the last 18 years. Something to do with your nervous energy, I guess, she said. Who's nervous? He asked, but she just smiled and kissed him. Sometimes, after he had been working on the car for a few hours, he would find himself stretched across the front seat, one leg hanging out the open door and a beer in hand, playing it back in his head. The afternoons when they went low-riding in the West Field, his daughter behind the wheel and the weeds slapping the sides of the Wraith. She had passed her driver's test on her first try, just 16 years old. 18 now, and she had her own car, a sporty little Jetta, was planning to drive it all the way to Dartmouth after she graduated. The thought of her out on the road by herself, checking into shabby motels and being checked out by the man behind the cash register, by the truckers in the hotel bar, made him antsy, revved him up with nervous energy. Michelle liked to do the wash, and he liked to let her, because when he came across her underwear in the dryer, colorful lace from Victoria's Secret, he began to worry about things like unwanted pregnancy and venereal disease. He had known how to talk to her about cars. He had liked watching her figure out how to work the clutch, how to steer true. He had felt like Gregory Peck in To Kill a Mockingbird then. He didn't know how to talk to her about men or sex, and was unsettled by his sense that she didn't need his advice on these matters anyway. Who's nervous? He asked the emptied garage one night and toasted his shadow. 6 days before the big dance, he put the engine back in the Wraith and closed the hood and stood back to consider his work, a sculptor studying the nude that had once been a block of marble. A cold season of banged knuckles and oil under his fingernails and rust flakes falling in his eyes. Sacred time important to him in the way transcribing a holy text was important to a monk in a monastery. He had cared to get it right, and it showed. The ebony body gleamed like a torpedo, like a polished slab of volcanic glass. The rear side door, which had been rusty and mismatched, had been replaced by an original, sent to him by a collector in one of the former Soviet republics. He had reupholstered the interior in kidskin leather, replaced the fold-out trays and drawers in the rear of the window with new walnut components, handmade by a carpenter in Nova Scotia. It was all original, even the vacuum tube radio, although he had toyed with the idea of installing a CD player, bolting a Bose subwoofer into the trunk. In the end, he had decided against it. When you had a Mona Lisa, you didn't spray paint a baseball cap on her. He had promised his daughter on some long ago hot thunderstormy summer afternoon that he would fix the rolls up for her prom, and here it was, finished at last with just under a week to spare. After prom, he could sell it, fully restored. The Wraith was good for $250,000 on the collector's market. Not bad for a car that cost just $5,000 American when it was released. Not bad at all when you considered he had just paid twice that to buy it in an FBI auction 10 years earlier. Who do you think owned it before you? Michelle asked one time after he mentioned where he got it. Drug dealer, I imagine, he said. Boy, she told him, I hope no one was murdered in it. It looked good, but looking good wasn't enough. He didn't think Michelle belonged in it, out on the road, until he had clocked a dozen miles on it himself, seen how it handled when it was all the way up to speed. Come on, you beautiful bitch, he said to the car. Let's wake you up and see what you can do. Demeter got behind the wheel, banged the door shut behind him, and turned the key. The engine slammed roughly to life, a ragged, almost savagely triumphant blast of noise, but then immediately settled down to a low, luxuriant rumble. The creamy leather front seat was more comfortable than the Tempur-Pedic bed he slept in. Back in the days when the Wraith had been assembled, things were built like tanks built to last. This car, he felt sure, would outlive him. He was right. He had left his cell phone on his work table, and he wanted it before he took the car out. Didn't want to wind up stranded somewhere if the Wraith decided to throw a rod or some such shit. He reached for the latch, which was when he got his first surprise of the afternoon. The lock slammed down, the sound of it loud enough that he almost cried out. The mentor was so startled, so unprepared, that he wasn't sure he had really seen it happen. But then the other locks went down, one after another. Bang, bang, bang. Just like someone firing a gun, and he couldn't tell himself he was imagining all that. What the fuck? He pulled at the lock on the driver's side door, but it stayed down as if welded in place. The car shuddered from the idling force of the engine, exhaust piling up around the sideboards. Dementor leaned forward to switch the ignition off, which was when he received his second surprise of the day. The key wouldn't turn. He wiggled it forward and back, then put his wrist into it. But the key was locked into place, fully engaged, couldn't be yanked out. The radio popped on, playing Jingle Bell Rock at top volume, so loud it hurt his ears, a song that had no business playing in the spring. At the sound of it, Dementor's whole body went rough and cold with chicken flesh. He poked the off switch, but his capacity for surprise was running thin, and he felt no special amazement when it wouldn't turn off. He punched buttons to change the station, but no matter where the tuner leaped, it was Jingle Bell Rock on every channel. He could see exhaust fogging the air now. He could taste it, the dizzying reek making him lightheaded. Bobby Helms assured him that Jingle Bell time was a swell time to haul around in a one-horse sleigh. Ooh. He had to shut that shit up, had to have some quiet, but when he spun the volume dial, it didn't go down, didn't do anything. Fog churned around the headlights. His next breath was a mouthful of poison and set off a coughing fit so strenuous it felt as if it were tearing away the inner lining of his throat. Thoughts flashed by like horses on an accelerating carousel. Michelle wouldn't be back home for another hour and a half. The closest neighbors were 3/4 of a mile away. No one around to hear him screaming. The car wouldn't turn off. The locks wouldn't cooperate. It was like something in a fucking spy movie. He imagined a hire killer with a name like Blowjob operating the Rolls Royce by remote control. But that was crazy. He himself had torn the Wraith down and put it back together, and he knew there was nothing wired into it that would give someone power over the engine, the locks, the radio. Even as these notions occurred to him, he was fumbling on the dash for the automatic garage door opener. If he didn't get some air in the garage, he would pass out in another moment or two. For a panicky instant, he felt nothing and thought, not there, it's not there. But then his fingers found it behind the raised hump of the housing for the steering wheel. He closed his hand around it, then pointed it at the garage door and pressed the button. The door rattled up toward the ceiling. The gear shift banged itself into the reverse position, and the Wraith jumped back at the door, tires shrilling. Nathan Dementor screamed, grabbed the steering wheel not to control the car but to have something to hold on to. The slender white walls grabbed at the pebble drive, throwing rocks against the undercarriage. The Wraith fell straight back like a cart on some mad backward roller coaster, plunging 300 feet down the steep grade of the driveway toward the lane below. It seemed to Nathan that he screamed the whole way, although in fact he stopped well before the car was halfway down the hill. The scream he heard was trapped in his own head. The Wraith didn't slow as it approached the road, but sped up, and if anything was coming from either direction, he would be T-boned at close to 40 miles an hour. Of course, even if nothing was coming, the Wraith would shoot across the road into the trees on the other side, and Nathan assumed he would be launched through the windshield on the recoil. The Wraith, like all the cars of its period, had no safety belts, not even lap belts. The road was empty, and when the rear tires hit the blacktop, the wheel spun in Nathan's hands, whirring so fast it burned his palms and he had to let go. The Wraith snapped around 90 degrees to the right, and Nathan Dementor was flipped across the front seat and into the left-hand door, bashed head first into the iron frame. For a time, he didn't know how badly he was hurt. He sprawled on the front seat, blinking at the ceiling. Through the passenger side window, he could see the late afternoon sky, a profoundly deep blue with a feathering of cirrus clouds in the upper atmosphere. He touched a tender spot on his forehead, and when his hand came away, he was looking at blood on his fingertips as a flute began to play the opening bars of the 12 Days of Christmas. The car was moving, had clunked down through the gears to fifth all on its own. He knew the roads around his house, felt they were moving east along Route 1638 to the Dixie Highway. Another minute and they would reach the intersection and what? Blow right through it? Maybe catch a truck coming north and be torn apart? The thought crossed his mind as a possibility, but he couldn't feel any urgency attached to it. Didn't think the car was on a kamikaze mission now. He had in some dazed way accepted that the Wraith was operating of its own agency. It had business and meant to do it. It had no use for him, was maybe not even really aware of him, any more than a dog might be aware of the tick stuck in its fur. He climbed up onto one elbow, swayed, sat up the rest of the way, and looked at himself in the rearview mirror. He wore a red mask of blood. When he touched his forehead again, he could feel a 6-inch gash traversing the upper curve of his scalp. He probed it lightly with his fingers and felt the bone beneath. The Wraith began to slow for a stop sign at the intersection with the Dixie Highway. He watched, mesmerized, as the gear shift dropped from fourth to third, clunked down into second. He began to scream again. There was a station wagon ahead of him waiting at the stop. 3 tow-headed, chubby-faced, dimpled-cheeked children were crammed into the back seat. They twisted around to look at the Wraith. He slapped his hands on the windshield, smearing rusty red prints on the glass. "Help!" he screamed, while warm blood leaked down his brow into his face. "Help! Help! Help me! Help me! Help!" The children inexplicably grinned as if he were being quite silly and waved furiously. He began to scream incoherently, the sound of a cow in the abattoir slipping in the steaming blood of those who went before. The station wagon turned right at the first break in traffic. The Wraith turned left, accelerating so quickly that Nathan Dementor felt as if an invisible hand were pressing him back into his seat. Even with the windows up, he could smell the clean late spring odors of mown grass, could smell smoke from backyard barbecues and the green fragrance of new budding trees. The sky reddened as if it too were bleeding. The clouds were like tatters of gold foil stamped into it. Absent-mindedly, Nathan Dementor noted that the Wraith was handling like a dream. The engine had never sounded so good, so strong. He thought it was safe to say the beautiful bitch was finally restored. He was sure he dozed, sitting up behind the wheel, but he did not remember nodding off. He only knew that at some point before it was fully dark, he closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the Wraith was racing through a tunnel of whirling snow, a tunnel of December night. The front windows were blurred with his own bloody handprints, but through them he could see snow devils unspooling across the black asphalt of a 2-lane highway that he didn't recognize. Skeins of snow moving like living silk, like ghosts. He tried to think if they could have gone far enough north while he slept to catch a freak spring snowstorm. He discarded the idea as idiotic. He weighed the cold night and the unfamiliar road and told himself he was dreaming, but he did not believe it. His own moment-by-moment tally of tactile experiences, throbbing head, face tight and sticky with blood, back stiff from sitting too long behind the wheel, was too convincing in its depiction of wakefulness. The car held the road like a panzer, never slipping, never wobbling, never slowing below 60. The songs played on. All I Want for Christmas Is You, Silver Bells, Joy to the World, It Came Upon a Midnight Clear. Sometimes Dementor was aware of the music. Sometimes he wasn't. No ads, no news, just holy choirs giving thanks to the Lord, and Eartha Kitt promising she could be a very good girl if Santa checked off her Christmas list. When he shut his eyes, he could picture his cell phone sitting on the work table in the garage. Would Michelle have looked for him there yet? Sure, as soon as she got home and found the garage door standing open and the garage itself empty, she would be, by now, out of her mind with worry, and he wished he had his phone, not to call for help. He believed he was well beyond help, but only because he would feel better if he could hear her voice. He wanted to call and tell her that he still wanted her to go to her prom, to try to have fun. He wanted to tell her he wasn't scared of her being a woman. If he had any true anxiety, It had been about himself getting old and being lonely without her, but he didn't think he was going to have to worry about that now. He wanted to tell her she had been the best thing in his life. He had not said that to her lately, and had never said it enough. After 6 hours in the car, he felt no panic, only a kind of numb wonder. On some level, he had come to view his situation as almost natural. Sooner or later, a black car came for everyone. It came and took you away from your loved ones, and you never got to go back. Perry Como warned Nathan in a chipper tone of voice that it was beginning to look a lot like Christmas. "No shit, Perry," Nathan said, and then in a hoarse, cracking voice he began to sing as he thumped on the driver's side door. He sang Bob Seger, sang about the old-time rock and roll, the type believed to soothe the soul. He belted it out as loudly as he could, one verse and another, and when he fell quiet, he found the radio had shut itself off. Well, that was a Christmas gift right there. Last one he'd ever get, he thought. Next time he opened his eyes, his face was pressed to the steering wheel and the car was idling, and there was so much light it hurt his eyes. He squinted, the world a bright blue blur. Not at any time in the night had his head hurt as bad as it hurt now. The ache in his skull was so intense he thought he might vomit. It was behind his eyes, a somehow yellow glare of pain. All that sunlight was unfair. He blinked to tears, and the world began to come into focus. A fat man in a gas mask and fatigues stared through the driver's side window at him, peering in past the smeared bloody handprints on the glass. It was an old gas mask, World War II era or thereabouts, a kind of mustardy green. "Who the fuck are you?" Nathan asked. The fat man seemed to be jiggling up and down. Nathan was unable to see the guy's face, but thought he was bouncing on his toes with excitement. The lock on the driver's side door shot up with a loud, steely bang. The fat man had something in one hand, a cylinder. It looked like an aerosol can. "Ginger Snap Spice Air Freshener," it said on the sign, and showed an old-fashioned painting of a cheerful mommy type pulling a pan of gingerbread man out of the oven. "Where am I?" Nathan Dementor asked. "Where the hell is this?" The gas mask man twisted the latch and opened the door onto the fragrant spring morning. "This is where you get out," he said.